everyone, and welcome to another episode of From a Woman to a Leader, a podcast dedicated to discussing women's unique challenges in the tech industry. And this is season 3, themed Negotiate Like a Woman. And in this episode, I'm super excited to share that I spoke with Leigh Honeywell. And Leigh is powerhouse in cybersecurity. She has over a decade of experience, and she's an entrepreneur and co-founded Tall Poppy. She has an impressive track record working with major tech companies like Slack, Salesforce, and Microsoft. Today, we're going to talk about negotiations. She's going to share some tips, but also she's going to talk about fundraising strategies and how to overcome biases. And there are biases against women when raising funds. So definitely for all women entrepreneurs, this episode is for you. We're also going to touch about women in cybersecurity and how we can get more women into that space. So definitely you don't want to miss that episode, and let's dive right in. Hi, Leigh. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for the invite. It's great to get to chat with you.
Absolutely. I'm super excited to talk to you today. And as you know, season 3 is about negotiating. So we're going to talk a little bit about negotiating. But before we do that, let our audience know a little bit about you, how you got into cybersecurity, how you got an expert in cybersecurity and founded also your company.
Oh man, so it's a bit of a long story, but I'll try to keep it brief. My name is Leigh Honeywell. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Tall Poppy. We do personal and executive cybersecurity for organizations with high-profile employees and stakeholders. And I've been working in cybersecurity for well over a decade at this point. Really got my start almost on accident. I was really interested in phone systems and telephony. And this was the sort of early days of voice over IP. Skype was like just a thing that people had started to hear about. And through folks that I met through that community, I ended up going to a computer security conference in New York City. This is the summer of 2005, I think it was. Summer of 2004, ancient history. I always joke that there's gray under the pink and orange hair, but it's not really a joke.
Love that.
So, I went to this hacker conference in New York City. I would later learn that the movie Hackers was somewhat inspired by the producers having visited this conference. And so which gives you a sense of the sort of aesthetics of things if you've ever seen the movie Hackers. But I was like, this is pretty cool. This is really interesting. I had always loved computing, computers, technology, but I was raised by lawyers. I did not have techie role models growing up. I had entrepreneurial role models in my dad, who started a law firm right out of law school, and models of leadership in my mom, who's a civil servant and just an incredible speaker and leader. But techie, not so much. It was all self-taught. And going to the security conference, I was like, this is so cool. Not only are we doing amazing things with technology, but people are so creative and kind of scary in the ways that they're doing sketchy things with technology. So I kind of got the bug that way and, bummed around sort of odd jobs. And I did a lot of IT support, kind of desk side stuff in the early days, and eventually found my way into my first real cybersecurity job at a email antivirus company, writing antivirus signatures for to keep viruses out of people's emails. And sort of the rest is history. I eventually went back to school. I finished my degree, went down to Seattle to work at Microsoft. If you run Windows, I was on the team that rebooted your computer with the security updates briefly. And from there, I went to Silicon Valley, worked at Slack, was one of the early security folks at the messaging company Slack. And in parallel to this sort of more traditional cybersecurity field, and I say, it's a long and winding road, but at the time, you couldn't go and get a degree in cybersecurity. The entry point really was that sort of whatever your winding road is, picking up these skills as you went. But I ended up in addition to that sort of traditional cybersecurity day job, doing a lot of work with people who are facing online harassment, online abuse, cyber stalking, and other sort of security focused technical interpersonal stuff. And developing this like unusual expertise in working with people who are dealing with this sort of new kind of threats. And in 2018, I started the company, really trying to figure out, is there a way that we can do the work that I was doing, getting on the phone with individual people who are dealing with these threats? Can we scale that up to something that, can meet the needs of a much wider set of people? In particular, by getting employers to pay for it for their employees when their employees were facing these threats in the course of their job. So that was like the big stroke of insight, was like, hey, let's get employers to help us build capacity in this space. And we've been pretty successful at it so far. And that's what I've been doing for the last 6 years, which is wild to think that it's been that long.
This is crazy how time flies, right?
It really, I mean, yeah, this is, it's the thing that they don't tell you about starting a company is that you're going to have a different job every 6 months. And it like, I've written and talked elsewhere a fair bit about, I have ADHD, and there's sort of a phrase that's used, which is that people with ADHD have an interest-based nervous system, that things need to be like interesting for us. And if they're interesting, we're like, oh, I'm on that. And starting a company, being an entrepreneur, I've had to learn so many different things. I've had to figure out how to do so many different things that I never realized when I was like, oh, I'm just going to do computer security stuff, right? Like, well, I'm also going to learn how to interact with the Secretary of State of Idaho to like figure out how to onboard an employee there, or how to like build a financial model in Excel, or all of these different things that are like very much outside of that core sort of skill set. And in some cases I've gotten super into them. And in other cases I'm like, I never want to do this task again. How can I get somebody like on my team so that I don't have to be the one dealing with this, because I'm either terrible at it or I really don't enjoy it, or sometimes both. So, yeah.
Absolutely. And you have a very impressive journey. And I want to touch on the negotiation piece, right? And
absolutely.
And the reason I want to talk about it so much, I'm so into negotiation and persuasion, is because as women, I'm not talking about you specifically or me, but in general, we're not that good. And we shy away from it.
It's interesting. I read a book, it's got to be over a decade ago at this point, called Women Don't Ask: Negotiation and the Gender Divide. And it was one of those like lightning bolt transformative moments in my life, was like getting this, like understanding the sort of big picture around gender, negotiation, workplaces, and it applies outside of workplaces too. There's so many different pieces of like socialization and like lived experience that go into the gender dynamics of negotiation. And I'd actually like very gently push back. It's not that we're bad at it. It's that we're actually like, there's a bunch of socialization that says it's not okay for women to negotiate. And even worse, in some cases, when women do negotiate, they're penalized for it. The good news is, and having done a little bit of a literature review going into this conversation, like the things have changed even in the decade and a bit since that book was written. Some of the research has shown that an increasing number of women are negotiating in, say, salary conversations, that the penalties that 15 years ago, when a woman would go to negotiate, I personally know people who have tried to negotiate jobs and had the offer withdrawn because they asked for too much, which is like bananas.
It's just crazy.
That was like a thing that, and it really, I think, clarifies that this fear, this sort of uncertainty that women have around negotiation, it's not like an irrational, like our lady brains can't handle negotiation, which I know is not what you were saying, just to be clear, but like it's coming from this very like real practical, we're making this economic estimate in our subconscious of like, if I negotiate, is it going to harm the relationship to the point that they're going to withdraw this job offer? They're not going to engage with me. So that's, things were definitely like, when that book came out, the state of play was pretty bad. And I think that there was this clarity around, this is a social problem. This is like an economic problem that, when women do try to do the economically advantageous thing of negotiating, that they're being penalized for it. And whether it's a function of like making sure that HR folks are trained in the, recruiting folks are trained to not penalize women who do negotiate, or some companies have tried tactics like not negotiating salaries. Like, this is the stated role, like the either the pay band, or like, this is the wage for this role that we've specified, and we're not going to negotiate up and down because we know that it has bias. I know that was something Ellen Pao tried when she was the CEO of Reddit. And I don't know if they've continued it since after her time there, but that is one tactic I've seen tried. And I actually really appreciate one thing, which is there's a trend in the US in particular of states requiring transparency of pay bands on job descriptions. We actually, when we hired for a role at the end of the year last year, we were hiring for the role in Canada, but we chose to publish pay bands for the role. And the feedback that we got from candidates was amazing. They were like very appreciative of having that transparency. There was one person who I really would have loved to work for, but it was not realistic given the salary that person was currently making. Like, we simply could not afford them. It saved everybody time. And it also like respected candidates' time, I think, in a major way. So there's a bunch of different like angles to this. I think the sort of socialization piece where, how are girls taught to negotiate, to interact in that sort of, in those scenarios, and then in workplaces, like what are the management practices that are in place? So
yeah. Absolutely. And I think publishing the pay bands is incredible, because one of the challenges is a lot of time you have no clue as a candidate. You have no clue,
not even a ballpark,
and you're afraid to aim too high, aim too low. You have no idea. So this is so relieving that at least for some states it's mandatory. But still we don't ask enough. In general, I'm generalizing. I can share that personally. I mean, I always felt well paid, and I asked for what I thought I should, and I got it. I got sometimes more than I asked for. So asking is a good thing, but we need to know how to ask. And I wonder if you have some strategies.
Yeah, I mean, I think the key thing from my experience is sort of preparation and market research. I think going into a negotiation with as much information as I'm able to obtain in advance around, whether it's a fundraising negotiation or a salary negotiation, going into a negotiation with that data, whether it's a fundraising negotiation, whether I'm hiring someone, back in the day when I was an employee, like when I was going into a role, knowing what those numbers are. And this is something where I think having sort of a set of peers, a posse, whatever you want to call it, like folks that are within your field where you can be transparent, where you can have those frank conversations, it is so essential to have those allies and colleagues to be able to talk like real numbers about, what roles are going for today in your market, have that real data. I'm a huge fan of practice. Like, it's so cheesy role playing this stuff, but it's so essential. It makes such a big difference, whether it's, you in front of the bathroom mirror or your friend who's a hiring manager, like, let's do a simulated conversation. I think it's so essential to be practicing this stuff. One of the things, this is such a cheesy anecdote, and I haven't told the story for 1,000 years. After I read the Women Don't Ask book, I made a very deliberate decision to do little tiny negotiations, ask for like just a little bit more in like appropriate scenarios. And the specific thing, I was traveling a lot at the time, my job, I did a lot of conference travel. And when the little airline drink cart would come by, I would be, may I have a glass of juice and a glass of water? Just like, not just one, I will have two. like just a little, and it was just working that muscle, like the gentlest little exercise of like, I'm going to ask for just a little bit more. And then a few years later, another good example of like a very low stakes way to practice this is my New Year's resolution was that I was going to be more assertive about asking to pet people's dogs. I would just make a daily practice. If I was out and about, I saw someone that was walking a cute dog, I'd feel like, may I please pet your dog? Just like automatic, I'm going to ask. And I think in a year of asking almost every day, I think I got maybe 3, he's not friendly. That was it. Everybody else like totally let me pet their dog.
That's incredible.
So, it was a really good year.
Incredible. And
but I think that identifying those ways of just a little bit of practice, like working that muscle, that was really important for me.
Yeah. And I think the low stakes practice is a great strategy.
It doesn't need to be a big deal.
Absolutely. Yeah. And
yeah.
I think that another thing, at least that helps me, is to think about it as something pleasant. The thing is that negotiation doesn't have to be like, at least I would imagine, very muscular people raising their voices, talking maybe
duking it out
angrily or so forth. Actually, it can be a very pleasant conversation.
Yeah. And I think that there's a very common recommendation around negotiating for a book called Never Split the Difference by
this is an incredible book.
And there's some good stuff in it, but there's some stuff in it that's like a little bit sociopathic, I think. And I think this is anyone who's ever heard me speak, like a thing that often comes up is like, coming into that conversation, part of that preparation and research is like, what are my values? What is important to me in this interaction? And how can I engage in this interaction, negotiation or not, in a way that's aligned with my values? And some of those values, hopefully, are getting what I deserve, like getting what I'm worth in an interaction. And I think that's where that other piece of preparation, the sort of meta preparation that we can all do in engaging in negotiation, is absorbing some of this research, understanding what some of the biases that everyone brings to the table of different genders, different like cultural backgrounds. Like we're all coming to the negotiating table with a set of biases and assumptions, and having some self-awareness of what those are on both sides of the table, I think is really important.
Absolutely. And I want us to talk about fundraising, right? I mean, this is another sort of negotiation that is probably very, very top of mind for you as an entrepreneur. And I know that there are a lot of biases against women when it comes to fundraising. So tell us a little bit about your experiences and any tips that you have.
Yeah, I mean, the numbers are so stark when it comes to venture capital. Certainly, I'm most familiar with the US numbers because it's the most like closely researched, but something like 2% of venture capital funds, like dollars, go to women founders. And when you look at women of color, the numbers are even more shocking. There's some really interesting, there's a bunch of, what are the technologies that people are investing in? There's this whole pipeline argument of like, well, fewer women are starting companies in like tech spaces. Because when you look at and this is, carries forward internationally, the number of businesses writ large that are started by women is well over 50%. But many of those businesses started by women are not in the sort of narrow set of businesses that are considered to be venture fundable. So that's the sort of landscape that we're playing in, is that there's this very specific set of businesses that are investable versus like something you would go, if you're starting a franchise or like a beauty salon is the sort of traditional stereotypical example. You go to the bank and you get a bank loan, and there's like a sort of known process for it. But venture-backed growth businesses, the expectation is that you're going to get venture capital, and there's a very specific shape of business that VCs are interested in investing in. And when you look at, so you have this pipeline piece that is sort of arguable of like how many, there are fewer, although not that many fewer. There are way more than 2% of venture backable businesses are founded by women. And yet. So when you look at what's actually happening in that conversation, in those interactions between women founders and venture capitalists, there's some amazing research. The two sort of leading researchers are Matthew Lee and Laura Wang out of Wharton. They've identified this particular bias referred to as promotion and prevention. Women founders get asked these prevention questions, where men founders are asked promotion questions. Prevention questions being sort of like knock you down a notch kind of questions, whereas the promotion questions are like, how big could this business be? Versus like, how are you going to do this very tactical small thing? And the sort of hypothesis is that this prevention versus promotion bias is getting in the way of venture capitalists seeing the potential of women's businesses, because all they can see is these roadblocks instead of like the big picture. And I think there's, from my own experiences, I have found it very hard sometimes to be like, this is the massive vision, right? Not only here's where we are right now, here's the sort of, we think it's a large opportunity, but here's the world changing thing. And when you read any of the sort of accounts, whether it's well, I guess Theranos is the exception because it was a woman founder, but any of these, like the WeWork, various books about WeWork and various books about these sort of other rise and fall stories, there's this theme that I see in many of them, which is like these folks that are raising billions of dollars on hype, they're able to just storytell in this like dramatic way, and very like, some of it is like, the sort of funny thing is like the term that is used to describe like, oh, I don't want to stick my head up too much. My company's called Tall Poppy. There's a phrase that's tall poppy syndrome, is people don't want to like stick their heads up too much because they get cut down. And sort of our analogy is like, we protect the tall poppies. But that sort of tall poppy syndrome is almost this like overreaction to, I don't want to hype myself too much. I don't want to like, I look at all these crazy stories of these hype machines, and I want to be real. I want to be concrete. But this is where the prevention versus promotion bias becomes really damaging. Even though I'm being conservative, I'm being realistic about growth. That's not what people want to hear. They want to hear, this is going to be a $1 billion business in 2 years. Like,
but they want to hear something realistic, isn't it? I mean, everyone can tell, well, this can be $1 billion.
You got to be able to tell a story of how you get there. And I think that's being able to tell a credible story. Some of the bias comes into what counts as credible, who gets to tell these huge stories. And the huge story that gets told and believed may be the same set of words as is coming out of a woman's mouth and not being believed. And I think that's the really like challenging piece. But yeah, so going in, learning about this prevention versus promotion research was a really like, kind of blew my mind, because it made me sort of look back at many of the conversations I've had with potential investors. And, for context, like we've raised just under $3 million US from a variety of angel investors. From Morgan Stanley, we were recently in their Inclusive Venture Lab Accelerator program, which
Incredible.
was amazing. Yeah, it was an awesome, like, just the program just like blew me away. But, this is relatively, in the grand scheme of venture capital, $3 million over 6 years is not a ton of money. And when I look back at many of the conversations I've had over the years where, I've been telling our story and talking about the thing that we're building, and I look back and I'm like, oh, that was 100% those prevention questions. And I did not address it in the way that like gets past the bias, right? And that's where this research, I'm frankly just really excited to have learned about it and learned from it, because it gives you these really concrete strategies for taking that bias, the biased questions, and turning them into those big picture questions in a way that's believable.
Okay, so there is a resource you can share that will give this
Yeah, I'll share a couple of links afterwards. There's a HBR article, that noted progressive publication, Harvard Business Review, has actually really good content on this. And yeah, really the fundamental strategies that they identified it's similar to, I don't know if you've ever done like media training where you get asked a question and you have to sort of pivot it to the thing that you wanted to say. But it's very similar to that in that it's like you have to identify that one of these biased questions has been asked and then gracefully answer it in a promotion way, even when you've been asked a prevention question. And there's this like nugget there that's so powerful of like, no matter what the question you get is, how to transform it into this positive style of question. And learning a little bit about that. I actually learned about it there was a guest lecture at the Morgan Stanley program. It totally changed my perspective on fundraising.
Wow, that's incredible. Yeah. If you can share resources, that will be incredible.
Absolutely.
Because, I know that women founders struggle. There's a real struggle.
And I think one of the challenges is like, it's not that your idea isn't good enough. It's not that you're not good enough as a founder. It's that there's this real structural issue in venture capital. And I think the folks that go into starting a business, you don't start a business because you're not self-motivated, right? Like, and so there's this sort of, I see this a lot with women founders that are just like struggling to raise money, struggling with the fundamentals of the business. And when I hear what they're getting, I hear how the conversations are going with venture capitalists or with investors, it's just so clear that they're running headfirst into bias. And that's super frustrating because you want it to be within your control, but it's not always within your control. And I think the promotion versus prevention, it's not a silver bullet. There are still VCs that are just never going to write checks to women. And that's a bummer, but let's at least give ourselves a fighting chance.
Yes, we can do whatever is within our control, right? We cannot change other people. And I want to make sure that we talk about the other topic I had, not related to negotiation, is about women in cybersecurity, because I want to have more women in tech, and cybersecurity is one of those areas where we see even fewer women. It's considered very muscular, very male, kind of, women don't belong here.
Certainly statistically, yeah. I mean, I think the biggest thing for me, fundamentally, we can't do this work effectively if we're missing out on 50% of the workforce, right? Like there is so much work to do, whether it's ransomware, whether it's account security issues, the rise of these like financial crimes using deep fakes, all of these like crazy things. Just over the past weekend, there was a whole fire drill over an open source project that had this incredibly sophisticated and subtle backdoor, like remote access vulnerability inserted into the code and had gone unnoticed for quite a while, like months to years, and was uncovered by a complete coincidence of somebody who worked at Microsoft realizing that his network connection was like slightly slow and going and digging and being like, oh my gosh, somebody snuck code into this project. Like it's totally wild. And this is like foundational infrastructure that all of computing is run on. It ended up being a vulnerability in the SSH remote access protocol, which is like pretty important. So this whole fire drill, all hands on deck. There just aren't enough hands on deck. And the idea that like women are being turned off of this field or are not thinking about going into it in the first place, just like it like breaks my heart and makes me really angry at the same time. So I'm like, this work is so interesting and satisfying where, I show up to work every day and my focus is protecting people. And that is like, I couldn't ask for a more fulfilling career. Not to mention the sort of long running joke of we put the security in job security. Like there is a lot of this work to do. And yeah, it's one of those things where like there's more work available than there are people. Organizations have not always been amazing at like onboarding junior people into the field. And, as we were talking about earlier, there aren't, even today, there are not a lot of like higher ed, like university or community college programs that get you up to speed with the skills that you need. So a lot of the work ends up being like, hey, I'm a computer programmer or a software engineer. I'm going to pivot into this field. But lots of folks are coming into the field from non-traditional backgrounds and non-technical backgrounds as well. So I think we got a lot of work to do in terms of making the field more welcoming to junior folks broadly. But I think we've actually made a lot of progress in the last couple decades around the fields like hostility to women. Certainly, there was a whole decade that like I did not go to the DEF CON security conference in Las Vegas because it was too hostile an environment. I had been harassed, I'd been hit on. Thankfully, nothing worse than that, but it was enough that I was just like, I don't want to deal with this. And I went last year for the first time in 10 years, and it was awesome. It was just great. I had a blast. And there were incredible. A lot more women there.
Yeah,
which
that's
was really
good to hear.
So, yeah, it really feels like a lot of progress.
So if women are interested in or they think, cybersecurity is the right area or maybe interesting for them, what should they do?
Oh gosh. I mean, I think discovering one's local community, there's the Security B-Sides conferences are community-run conferences that happen in over 200 cities around the world. There is probably one near you within the next 6 months. Those have always been, and they're typically very affordable or free. There's often security meetups, just on a variety of different topics. There's great public resources like OWASP, which is a nonprofit, and there's other sort of online learning opportunities. Google has a cybersecurity certificate, which is super random. There are centers of excellence and sort of research facilities that have, I've started to see a fair number of like certificate programs and boot camps, similar to what we saw 10 years ago with software boot camps in general, with a gentle caution there that they do vary in quality. But there are some really good programs like that out there. But really just finding community, starting to follow some security news sources, like Bruce Schneier's email newsletter is fantastic. The Risky Business podcast is a great resource. And yeah, I think getting plugged into that sort of ecosystem is really like the place that I would start, especially coming from a completely outside field. If someone is already in technology like software, there's a pretty natural transition. If someone isn't already doing something techie related, skilling up on sort of general like software development practices, there's this bajillion resources out there for that kind of thing. But I think the sort of two-step of building those technical skills and engaging in community, that's really the path that I've seen be really successful.
That's incredible. Thank you so much for sharing. And yes, any links you can share later on, let me know and I'll put it on the show notes. And before we...
Yeah, easy to find at leighhoneywell.com, and the company is at tallpoppy.com. And really appreciate the conversation.
So you already kind of answered my... you read my minds. Yeah, I wanted to...
My pluggables, they say on some podcasts.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I'll put definitely your email, your company.
Awesome.
Thank you so much for being here today. It's been a pleasure, Leigh.
This was super fun. I really appreciate the conversation.
Thank you so much for listening to another episode of From a Woman to a Leader. I'm your host, Limor Bergman-Gross, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation I just had with Leigh Honeywell. I would appreciate your feedback as always, so feel free to comment and review our podcast. Before you go, I want to share a teaser for the next episode that you don't want to miss. I'm speaking with Lindsay Whitmer-Collins, and she said that it's all about recognizing your worth, facing biases head-on, and building your own path in the tech world. That's right. Next week, I'll be speaking with Lindsay Whitmer-Collins, the founder and CEO of WLCM App Studio, and she has an incredible story about turning career challenges into a thriving business. So definitely, if you want to gain insights on overcoming workplace biases, effective negotiation, and building resilience, this episode is for you. Make sure to subscribe and follow From a Woman to a Leader on your favorite podcast platform so you don't miss another episode. And as always, feel free to reach out and share What do you think about the episode? And what would you like to hear next? Thank you so much, and see you next week.